Back on April 17th of 1993, a set of skeletal remains were discovered by some kids that were playing in Greenwood, Indiana. So Greenwood is south of the capital of Indianapolis, and I just want you to understand geographically where it is in Indiana. So this discovery, or these set of remains, were found near Interstate 65, which is now known as the Ott Golf Course, OTTE, um, in which the area that the children found these remains. The police department responded, and these remains were then transported to the University of North Texas to further examine and basically determine what happened to this person. So this person was then determined to be 14 to 30 years of age and stood between 4'10" and 5'4". So this was a very small human. But these remains were not determined to be human until about a year and a half after the remains were found. So we found them on April 17th of 1993, but more than a year, like a year and a half later, so we're talking like October, November of 1994, this is when it was determined that this was a human. I don't know why it would have took so long, but that's besides the point. There were some characteristics of the bones, or just like one in particular that was very strange, which his sternum, so your breastbone right here, had two holes in it instead of one. Typically there's a hole in your sternum, but he had two. So there is some type of a deformity that happened. This trait is only shared by 5% of the general population in the world, having the two holes rather than one single hole. Like many cases I cover in 2008, so specifically in May of 2008, the details of this case were then entered into NAMUS, N-A-M-U-S, as UP1828, even though there was some extensive effort by law enforcement to try and identify this man, they couldn't. There was no matches found, and the case went cold due to the lack of any leads for this case. The Johnson County Coroner's Office collaborated with the Greenwood Police Department and the University of Indiana and the Indiana State Police. They then teamed up with Othram to determine if some advanced DNA testing could help with the identification process of this man. Once it was agreed upon in 2023, forensic evidence was then sent to Othram's lab, which is in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram then was able to complete a DNA genome sequence, building this comprehensive DNA sequence for this man. So the costs of this casework were provided by AudioChuck, which I talked about in a previous upload, and Othram then was able to produce a full genome for the police. Then they could end up figuring out who this man is. With using this genome sequence that Othram was so gracious to produce and build, they then were able to find, with obviously the police, they were able to reference DNA samples that were collected by potential relatives, and they compared it to the DNA of this unknown male. This would then lead to the positive identification of this man, who is now known to be Michael Benjamin Davis. Michael Benjamin Davis was born back on December 16th of 1965 in Richland County, South Carolina. He would have been in his mid-20s around the time of his death, and the investigation into his demise still continues because they are unsure as to what has happened. His identification is the 9th for the state of Indiana, with using the technology that's been developed by Othram. In most recent identifications, we had that of the Vigo County John Doe, who was Mitchell Preston, and he was identified after 26 years of him being unidentified. Othram has made some very distinct identifications that has helped us in one way or another with the whole true crime community. So thank you, Othram. Thank you to the police who also didn't stop their efforts. Thank you to just everybody involved in this case to identify who this is, which we know as Michael Benjamin Davis. And it was known that he regularly moved around the country with his family. He also joined a traveling circus and lost contact with his family around 1988, hence why I would assume they didn't report him missing because they had lost contact with him. So it's one of those things where you don't know unless you investigate it and look further into it, which they are doing with his death in itself. So I stand corrected. In May of 1992, children were playing near 1095 Vicksburg Drive, and they found bones lying on open ground. They took the bones, brought it home, showed their parents, and the parents thought it was an animal, and they just completely disregarded it. So this area, which I talked about, which is the Ott Golf Course now, was a subdivision about 300 and 400 yards away from the I-65, Interstate 65. So it's about a quarter mile south of the Greenwood interchange. Bones were also found in the same area on April 17th of 1993. This is where we first started. So initially, bones were found a year prior, but parents didn't think anything of it. I wanted to give a little bit more about the discovery. There was 150 bones that were recovered, and the only bones that were in its that were fully intact were the femurs. Many of the bones had cut marks as well. These remains were left on the farm field. In this farm field was used to grow soybeans and corn. But these bones hadn't been there for more than 3 years, which is what was determined. These remains were scattered all over the place, probably because of plowing and tilling the area. The farming equipment that is using, the police believe, had cut these bones and moved them around. Detectives also walked the farm area as well with metal detectors, but they couldn't find any personal belongings or a weapon, any cartridges, like spent cartridges from a gun, a knife, anything like that. There wasn't any personal items found with the remains either, but they did determine the lack of personal items heightened the thought that this was not this foul play happened, basically, is what I'm saying. And these remains were initially thought to be female, but in April of 2010, it was determined that this was a male. So at first, this Doe case was determined to be female, but then identified as male. I would assume probably because of the size, they thought it was female, but men also can be smaller as well. And the estimated time of death for this male was 2 to 3 years prior to being found. So the bones were initially found in May of 1992. If you think about it, he probably died in 1989, but since he was already skeletal, we can probably bring it back to 1988, which is when he lost contact with his family. So more than likely, he has been dead for the actual date of discovery. I would say probably about 5 years, but that's just my guesstimation. I know they are still working on this case, so it's one of those things where you're like, well, and there was only about 70 to 75% of his remains found that were skeletal, like partial skeletal parts only. So when it comes to partial skeletal, it means there could still be some degraded body matter on the bones, but we don't know to what extent because a lot of those things are not readily available for us because we're not in, law enforcement and things like that. But that, my friends, is the identification of Michael Benjamin Davis, who has finally been identified since just bearing the name of the 1993 John Doe.